Welcome, everyone. Thank you for being here tonight for Friends of the Upper East Side book talk with Bill Hennessy of his Fifth Avenue book. We're going to talk about the book in a little bit, and first, I'd like to introduce Friends for those who don't know who Friends is. We are a 40-year-old non-for-profit organization that is dedicated to the celebration and preservation of the architectural legacy, livability, and sense of place of the Upper East Side. Before we move on to the talk, I'd like to remind everyone that if you'd like to ask some questions, please do that by using the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. I will be monitoring them, and we'll go over the questions at the end of the talk. Also, I will be dropping in the chat a link and a discount code to purchase both the Fifth Avenue book and Bill's other book with Broadway, right?
That's right.
Yeah. But if you are joining us for the in-person walking tour that Bill will lead for us on November 12th, just keep in mind that your ticket does include a copy of the book. So if you want to join us, I would suggest using that 20% off to buy the Broadway book, and the Fifth Avenue book is included with the walking tour. Now, Bill is an art historian who has taught at many different universities, and for a good chunk of time, he was the director of the Chrysler Museum of Art. And Bill, the floor is all yours.
Okay, thank you very much. Good evening, everyone. As we get started here, I'm going to share my screen here so we can. There we go. I think we're ready. And welcome to this very fast and paced walk, the entire length of what may be New York's most celebrated avenue. You know, just about everyone. I'm going to do one more thing here since. Sorry. There's always technology to be dealt with. Let's see if it works this time. There we go. Fifth Avenue, as I said, probably, if not the most famous street in New York, the most celebrated in the world. It's a 7-mile stretch running from Washington Square all the way up to the Harlem River. About 7 miles that are pretty much synonymous with wealth, glamour, the good life. Fifth Avenue is home to what many would think of as the best, the most elegant, the most sophisticated aspects of New York. But when you ask people about their favorite part of Fifth Avenue, you'll probably get a lot of different answers. For example, some people think of it as a street of great institutions, and others say, no. Some of New York's most glorious cathedrals and churches are located along Fifth Avenue. Others would say it's a street of great hotels, or of exclusive clubs, or perhaps a place where you can find some of the most beautiful parks and gardens in New York. Maybe for you, it's a street for shopping, or a place to go to see New York's iconic skyscrapers, or perhaps some of its most beautiful monuments and memorials. But I think above all, Fifth Avenue is a street of residences, a place to live. Whether you live in an apartment house or in a private home of one side or another, Fifth Avenue was from the very, very beginning thought of as a street where people who could do so would want to live. So let's back up a little bit and see how and why that residential character came to be. Manhattan, as we know, grew from south to north, starting with a small Dutch settlement down at the Battery. And in the early days, people lived and worked in close proximity to the docks, the warehouses, the workshops that were the sources of their income. And today, Lower Manhattan remains a kind of warren of streets that grew without plan in response to day-to-day commercial needs. And as wealthy people accumulated money, those who could afford it began to carve out residential enclaves away from the noise and the confusion of the business center. Broadway developed in this way first, but things moved on. And soon a pattern emerged. As the city grew, commerce pushed ever farther northward, and the wealthy fled before it. And as New Yorkers grew and got bigger and bigger, the city quickly realized that the old way of doing the city haphazardly just wasn't going to work, and that some kind of comprehensive development plan became necessary. So in 1811, the city created a commission that developed a plan for the future development of Manhattan north of what's now Houston Street. And that's the plan you see on the screen in front of you. Now, this plan was based on a couple of underlying assumptions. A fundamental one to that is that waterborne commerce, trade, is really New York's raison d'etre. We have this extraordinary harbor here. And that commerce was naturally concentrated along the water, along the edges of the island and in its rivers. And then as manufacturing developed, things like tanneries, slaughterhouses, foundries that also needed water also concentrated around the edges. This left the center of the island on high ground, dry, away from the noise and the dirt of the rivers, as choice residential territory. And when the commissioners laid out their plan, they saw right from the start that Fifth Avenue, right in the center of the island, marked in red here, place from which numbers radiate out to the east and the west, was going to be prime residential territory. So from that point of view, the story of Fifth Avenue, of its evolution, is primarily the story of the northern migration of New York's wealthy, of their search for an attractive and lovely place to live. Well, that story begins very auspiciously with Stanford White's great arch in Washington Square Park at the foot of Fifth Avenue. Now, Washington Square is an interesting history. In the 17th century, this land was given by the early Dutch settlers to freed slaves as a kind of buffer between the Dutch settlement to the south and the sometimes hostile native tribes to the north. By 1797, the city had purchased the land as a kind of potter's field, a burial spot for people who had no other place to be interred. And then in 1826, they converted it to a parade ground, a place where soldiers could practice and march. And finally, in 1849, it actually became a park. Well, by the 1830s, the blocks around that playground had become an attractive place for bankers, merchants, and politicians to live. And particularly the land to the east of Fifth Avenue, which actually at this point in 1830 was an undeveloped dirt track. The land nearby belonged to a man named Captain Robert Richard Randall. And at his death, way back in 1801, he left all his property to an organization called Sailors' Snug Harbor. This was an organization that existed to provide safe homes and a place of retirement to, as he put it, decrepit sailors. Well, the trustees of Sailors' Snug Harbor decided that they had better use for the land. So around 1830, they leased plots of land there to prosperous people with the provisions that they build a set of houses quickly within a certain amount of time, and that it be done in an elegant Greek revival style. Beautiful red brickwork, fine limestone porticos and steps, beautiful cast iron fence. Today, this row of houses remains among the most beautiful in all of New York. Well, with the northern sides of Washington Square taken up by housing, people turned the corner and began looking at Fifth Avenue itself. The first man to really build a substantial home there was an old Dutch planter named Brevoort. And this is his house that we built in 1834 at the corner of 9th Street and Fifth Avenue. And he set the standard. And soon the blocks surrounding him began to fill up. For example, in 1852, a coal magnate by the name of Irad Hawley built this handsome house at Fifth Avenue and 11th Street. It's now the Salamagundi Club. And then a few years later, John Taylor Johnson, a wealthy individual who went on to become the first president of the Metropolitan Museum of Art, built his house on the southwest corner of 8th Street. The result is that by the 1850s, both sides of Fifth Avenue were lined solid with dignified Italianate houses, often built of the then popular brownstone. And when residential neighborhoods develop, amenities quickly follow. These include churches. In 1840, the church on the left there, that's Ascension Episcopal Church, went up to designs by Richard Upjohn, who also designed Trinity Church at the head of Wall Street. And it was followed 6 years later by First Presbyterian Church, designed by an Englishman named Joseph C. Wells. These were the first churches built on Fifth Avenue. And following the churches, our friend Henry Brevoort is back, and in 1845, he erected this hotel across the street from Ascension Church at the northwest corner of 5th and 8th Street. This hotel actually stood until 1852 and was the scene of some remarkable events. For example, this is where Charles Lindbergh went to collect his prize for flying solo across the Atlantic. 1930s, Mabel Dodge Lujan had her famous salon inside this hotel. And around 1904, Mark Twain lived in the house immediately next door. Well, as Fifth Avenue began to develop, the village began to change around it and to become artistic in a way. This process began in 1858 when Richard Morris Hunt, celebrated architect, built the 10th Street Studio Building just off Fifth Avenue. It was here that artists like Frederick Church and John Lafarge, Eastman Johnson, William Merritt Chase all had their studios. And they set the tune for an increasing number of artists to move into Greenwich Village. For example, Lockwood DeForest arrived in 1887 and built his own house on East 10th Street, decorating it with these extraordinary teakwood carvings that came from a workshop that he founded on his honeymoon in Ahmedabad, India. Gertrude Vanderbilt Whitney arrived in 1912 when she bought up a number of brownstones and other townhouses on Muses on 8th Street and opened the Whitney Studio that within a few years had evolved into the first home for the Whitney Museum of American Art. And then following this same trend, when it came time for the trustees of Sailors Snug Harbor to redevelop some of the properties that they owned closer to Washington Square, they took the now obsolete stables behind those houses and turned them into artistic studios that were in great demand for people, even if they weren't artists. Well, time marches on, and by the early 20th century, as the neighborhood became increasingly bohemian, occupants of the private homes along Fifth Avenue in the lower sections moved on, and those houses were often converted into boarding houses or ultimately demolished to make way for the apartment houses that now dominate the blocks along Fifth Avenue south of 12th Street. They range from this wonderful Beaux-Arts classic on the left, number 45 Fifth Avenue, to my favorite, the great Art Deco skyscraper apartment at number 1 Fifth Avenue. To the north, educational institutions began to arrive. For example, the New School built its wonderful, extraordinarily stylish building on 12th Street in 1930. And has continued to grow ever since, adding the building on the right, its new flagship headquarters at the corner of Fifth Avenue and 14th Street in 2010. Buildings like these quickly were surrounded by commercial ventures of all kind. For much of the 20th century, in fact, the blocks between 14th and 23rd Street were dominated by the publishing industry. And it was also a favorite spot for New York architects to locate their offices. And I'll give you two examples here. On the right-hand side is the Presbyterian Building, and on the left, the Methodist Book Concern, built in 1888. They face each other on Fifth Avenue across 20th Street, giving this block the nickname of Pater Noster Row. Perhaps the most beautiful publishing building in this section of Fifth Avenue, however, is this one that was put up in 1893 by the great French trained architect Ernest Flagg for Charles Scribner. As we'll see, Scribner commissioned Flagg to do two more buildings for him further up Fifth Avenue. One is a second bookshop and publishing house, and even his house further north. These are also the blocks where Fifth Avenue began to emerge as a serious retailing center. Now, up until now, Fifth Avenue has been in an interesting spot retail-wise. The fashionable shopping street in New York for much of the 19th century was Fifth Avenue. That's where was Broadway. That's where all the carriage trade shops were located. And then to the west on 6th Avenue were more middle-class shops serviced by an L. Fifth Avenue was sandwiched in the middle. The result of that is that as the Arnold Constable store, which faced onto Broadway, needed to expand around 1876, it moved westward to put another facade facing onto Fifth Avenue. This is the first major retail shop to appear there, but it's important to remember that this was the backside of the Arnold Constable store, not the front. Constable Empire grew. They grew a little bit like a lot of real estate. They began developing buildings like this next door. And in the familiar pattern that we're going to see, as retail arrived, people who used to live in mansions in this block fled north. For example, August Belmont, the celebrated American representative of the Rothschild financial empire, the developer of the first New York City subway's house, was on this site where the Constable building now stands until it was demolished to make way for commercial expansion. When one arrives at 23rd Street, one arrives at really one of New York's great buildings, the Flatiron, built in 1901 by Daniel Burnham, to house the construction company, the George Fuller and Son. This is the first tall building erected not just on Fifth Avenue, but anywhere north of 14th Street. And it was among the first in New York to be built with a steel frame. And it's become a favorite of artists over the years, perhaps the most depicted building in New York City. Now, 23rd Street is, of course, the spot, Madison Square, where Fifth Avenue and Broadway intersect. Madison Square is that intersection, and it set aside in the early commissioner's plan not as a simple square, but as a huge area called a parade that ran all the way from 23rd to 34th Street. And that parade was steadily reduced in size. To 1837, the park took on its present size. Now, the key development that made that intersection and that park a fashionable place to live and be in New York was the opening of this building. This is the Fifth Avenue Hotel, opened by an entrepreneur named Amos Eno in 1856. People scoffed. They said, my gosh, 23rd Street, no one in their right mind would go that far north. But Eno pointed out that this was at the top of the ladies' shopping mile, and that Manhattan was, in fact, evolving northwards. And he was right. The success of the hotel, and it was a huge success, led to Madison Square being home for all manner of fashionable residences and amenities. For instance, Delmonico's restaurant arrived in 1876. In 1879, the original Madison Square Garden opened, replacing an old railway terminal. And then in 1890, the building you see on the left of the screen here, that's Stanford White's great new Madison Square Garden, opened to great acclaim. This was the place in New York where in 1899 the city erected a celebratory arch to honor Admiral Dewey on his return for his victory in Manila, and General Pershing got the same ceremonial arch in 1918. However, the inevitable happened, and by the First World War, by 1918, this section of Fifth Avenue had become commercial once again, and fashion had moved farther north. As an evidence of that, you can see in the right screen the tall towers, not just of the Flatiron Building, but of the Metropolitan Life Building, testifying to the changing character of the square. Now, the blocks today, north of the square, are dominated by small to medium-sized loft buildings. Some of them actually quite interesting. For example, there on the right is 242 Fifth Avenue from 1885 by George Harding. I love the combination of classical and fanciful elements in that facade. In the middle, Eli Jacques Kahn's building at 261 Fifth Avenue, a riot of terracotta Art Deco motifs. And then if you like terracotta, you might like Alfred Zucker's building at 256 Fifth there on the right-hand screen. These blocks were also long the home of apartment hotels, many of them catering to the large numbers of young bachelors who came to the city to earn their stripes in the business world. Two examples survive. Here's the Wilbraham on the left from 1888, a wonderful blend of a French mansard roof, terracotta brickwork, rustic stone, and nice brick in between. On the right is the Holland House that was briefly the successor of the Fifth Avenue Hotel as New York's most fashionable place to live. It was here that the annual coaching parade up Fifth Avenue began for decades. Well, by the time we reach 34th Street, we're in for a big change. In 1856, William B. Astor and his wife Caroline, that is the Mrs. Astor, built a sober, understated, actually rather boring brownstone mansion at the southwest corner of Fifth Avenue and 34th Street. They moved there north from Astor Place, the family's original home. This is a old New York building, even if it had tucked on the back a ballroom that held room for 400, the celebrated people who were invited to Mrs. Astor's parties. Another Astor, John Jacob, built his house immediately to the south on the same block. Then directly across the 34th Street from Mrs. Astor's mansion, this building went up. 1869, the department store magnate A.T. Stewart, one of the wealthiest new money men in New York, built a very different kind of house. It was freestanding. Instead of brownstone, it was made of gleaming white marble. It had a fashionable French marble roof, and the detailing, as you can see, was anything but recessive. This is a house that simply screamed, "Look at me," the very opposite of the kind of thing that old line New Yorkers, the old money people, would have liked. Mr. Stewart, however, was looking ahead. And as you'll see, his house signaled a major shift in taste towards flaunting the money if you have it. It is a key to understanding the mansions that we're going to encounter further north. But we're not through with the corner of Fifth Avenue and 34th Street, because another big change was about to happen. In 1890, the Astor on the southern end of the block, John Jacob, decided to move to England. He sold his house and it was demolished, and Henry Hardenberg's Waldorf Hotel was built on the site. That's the tall building that you see on the left side of the screen here. This left the other branch of the Astor family a little bit at a loss. Who wants to live next to a huge teeming hotel? So 7 years later, they sold out as well, brought back Hardenberg, and the Astoria Hotel was built. That's the part of the building to the right here, to create the first Waldorf Astoria that was instantly New York's most luxurious, famous, and fashionable hotel, with a total of 1,300 rooms. Mrs. Astor, for her part, saw where things were going and, as we'll see, moved north. And yet the story continues onwards, because in 1929, the Waldorf Astoria Hotel, by that time, too far downtown, very unfashionable, a little dated, was demolished, and this building went up. The Empire State Building, still arguably one of New York's very greatest skyscrapers, and a kind of symbol for the city. Now, wealthy residents were not the only people that were moving northward. Retail, too, was on the march. And a seismic event took place in 1905 when Benjamin Altman relocated his store from 6th Avenue on the Ladies Mile north to the northeast corner of 5th Avenue and 34th Street. That is to say, directly or diagonally across from the Waldorf Astoria Hotel. Altman's rationale was simple. He wanted to be near his clients. And he also recognized that having a store on 5th Avenue brought with it a certain cachet. He also was not unaware that some big railway construction was taking place. This was the moments just before the opening of Penn Station on 34th Street and Grand Central Station to the north. And Altman clearly hoped that his store, midway between those two great terminals, would be convenient to shoppers coming in from the suburbs. When he commissioned his store, Altman went for something different than the flashy stores that had been the norm down on the Ladies Mile. His building, designed by Trowbridge and Livingston, has a kind of dignity. It is sober, serious. It's kind of a building that 5th Avenue would not be averse to. Well, the arrival of Altman invited others to come too. People saw this opportunity to open stores on 5th Avenue and joined in. Tiffany and Companies opened their store, designed by Stanford White, at 5th Avenue and 37th Street in 1903. This was their 5th store in New York City. They marched steadily northwards from their start downtown. And the Gorham Silver Company also commissioned White to design the building one block to the south. This is the one on the right, a few years earlier. And then others followed as well. Lord & Taylor opened in 1913 on 5th Avenue. And Arnold Constable, the store we saw downtown in that fancy mansarded building on 18th Street, opened in 1914, their last store in New York. Both of these have now gone on to other uses. Amazon has bought the old Lord & Taylor store there on the left, and the Constable store on the right has now been very handsomely converted into the Stavros Niarchos Library, a branch of the New York Public Library. Now, this sudden transformation of 5th Avenue caused no little alarm to 5th Avenue's wealthy residents, who were determined to maintain as much as possible of the avenue's traditional, dignified, elegant character. They got together in 1907 and formed the 5th Avenue Association and immediately took action. And one of the things they took action against was this. Now, after the change in New York zoning laws, the famous 1901 Tenement Act, and particularly after the tragic Triangle Shirtwaist Fire of 1911, a lot of the garment manufacturing lofts and sweatshops on the Lower East Side moved north. They did so because they were forced out by new laws, and also because they too wanted to be near their clients. Why not have your factory near the department stores that were going to be the ultimate destination for the clothing made there? The owners of the 5th Avenue mansions that remained, and even some of the department stores, were a little alarmed by this. They felt that the mix of their wealthy customers and garment workers was not a good one. So the 5th Avenue Association lobbied for changes in the great landmark 1916 zoning law that New York passed to control not only building height along 5th Avenue, but to exclude manufacturing, that's to say garment lofts, from the blocks abutting 5th. This was the zoning change that brought about the creation of today's garment district to the west of 7th Avenue in the high 30s and 40s. The 5th Avenue Association was also concerned about traffic and made sure that two things didn't happen. 5th Avenue is one of the only avenues in New York, perhaps the only avenue in New York, that has never had an elevated train running along it. never had a subway running underneath it, and never had a tramway or trolley system running along its blocks. These were carefully made decisions to protect the character of the street. What Fifth Avenue did have, however, was buses. The celebrated Fifth Avenue Coach Company with its double-decker buses that right up through the 1950s became an absolutely obligatory ride for any visitor to New York. By the 1960s, the company had gone out of business, and these same routes, as you see number 1 there on the left, still are numbers for New York City's buses. Fifth Avenue Association was also concerned with other kinds of traffic along Fifth Avenue. And in 1920, they pressed the city to install New York's first traffic signal. It went up at that busy corner of Fifth Avenue and 34th Street. It worked, kept traffic under control. And pretty soon, the association paid to install 7 more traffic signals, towers like the one you see here, all the way up north to 57th Street at crucial intersections. Now, there was one problem with these traffic signals, is they were designed to speed traffic along, but because they were placed in the middle of the traffic, they also impeded it, and people were, with some frequency, running into the towers. So in 1931, the association came back and commissioned a new design. And I remember when I was a kid seeing these extraordinary streetlights lining Fifth Avenue in Midtown. They were on the sides of the street rather than the center. They were vaguely classical in design. They were gilded bronze, and on top of each one was a 17-inch tall gilded statue of the Greek god Mercury. I think these traffic signals contributed a lot to the aura that for much of the 20th century made Fifth Avenue the world's shopping capital, what one writer has called the Via Appia of opulence. Well, Fifth Avenue undergoes another big change, a change in personality, when we get to 42nd Street. In 1842, fresh water from upstate arrived in New York through the Croton Aqueduct system. And to store that water and prepare it for distribution to the rest of the city, a huge reservoir covering 4 acres was built at the corner of Fifth Avenue and 42nd Street. And you see it here in this picture. That reservoir lasted until 1911 when it was demolished, and it was replaced by the first great civic institution to appear along Fifth Avenue. This, of course, is Carrere and Hastings' beautiful New York Public Library, and it was a signal of things to come. Then something else happened. In 1913, 2 years later, Grand Central Terminal opened 2 blocks to the east, and the neighborhood was transformed. Suddenly, for the first time, central Manhattan was accessible to commuters and suburban dwellers. And the creation of the station instantly made the blocks nearby the hottest commercial real estate in the city. Suddenly, the corner of Fifth Avenue and 42nd Street became, with the corner of Broadway and Wall Street, the most expensive commercial building site in the city. The building that rose there, 500 Fifth Avenue, is a kind of skyscraper masterpiece. It was designed by the same team, Shreve, Lamb and Harmon, that built the Empire State Building down on 34th Street. And it's a building that, in its wonderfully inventive silhouette, is worth further looking. That's true of the building next door as well. This is Gordon Bunshaft's 1953 Manufacturers Trust Building at the corner of Fifth Avenue and 43rd Street, kind of elegant, understated masterpiece of the international style. And then across the street, one of my favorite buildings, the Fred French Building from 1926. I'm not sure there's any building in New York that has so much beautifully, richly colored and decorated terracotta on its exterior. And the lobby is also, by the way, worth, as you can see, a visit. Well, as development continued, Fifth Avenue, north of 42nd Street, also became a neighborhood of churches. And in the 1880s, there were no fewer than 7 houses of worship on Fifth between 43rd Street and 56th Street. Today, only 3 of those remain, but they're beauties. St. Thomas's on the left there, St. Patrick's Cathedral in the center, and Fifth Avenue Presbyterian on the right. These blocks of Fifth Avenue in Midtown are also the home of one of New York's great jewels. This, of course, is Rockefeller Center, built between 1931 on 39 on land then owned by Columbia University. A brilliant amalgam of art and commerce, place of business, of entertaining, of shopping. It's a city planning triumph that remains a kind of town square to New York even today, and an absolute must-see site for visitors. High-end retail is still very much present along these blocks. The legacy of Tiffany and Gorham and Altman remains. There on the left is the second bookshop that Ernest Flagg built for Charles Scribner. Up top, of course, Bergdorf Goodman, and on the right, the 6th and so far final headquarters for Tiffany and Company at the corner of 57th Street and 5th Avenue. Now, all of this commercial development meant that a lot of the residential homes that were along 5th Avenue in this stretch were demolished. You remember that back in the 1980s, the 5th Avenue in the 50s was really Vanderbilt territory. And during those years, no less than 8 increasing elaborate palaces were built in these blocks by different members of the family. Today, they're all gone. But there are a few houses from that era that still survive. For example, the Morton Plant House from 1903 here is now the headquarters of Cartier. And just around the corner at 647 5th Avenue, half of what were once a pair of identical houses called the Marble Twins has been converted for retail use as well. Now, at 59th Street, 5th Avenue meets Central Park with extraordinary results. Grand Army Plaza is another of New York's truly great public spaces. I mean, just look around this. You have the Plaza Hotel on one corner. You have Jacques Lacan's great Squibb building from 1930 on the other, the Sherry Netherland and Pierre hotels at the top there. And less successful is Edward Durrell Stone's GM building, but today it is mitigated to a slight degree by Norman Foster's elegant Apple store that fills the plaza out front. And speaking of the plaza, this, of course, is the location of Augustus St. Gaudens's great monument to General Sherman from 1903, to the fountain that was endowed by Mr. Pulitzer to perpetuate his name in his newspaper empire, all in a plaza created in 1913 by the firm of Carrere and Hastings, who, of course, designed the New York Public Library. Now, Grand Army Plaza, where we stand now, marks the beginning of the Upper East Side, an area that inexplicably was slow to develop. Remember Central Park, just to the west here. The plan for the park was adopted way back in 1857, and work on the park was largely complete by 1876. But through the 1880s, the social center of New York was still anchored around all those Vanderbilt houses down in the 50s. Then 2 events happened that changed all of that. One was that Carolyn Astor, Mrs. Astor, departed from her home on 34th Street and built a new home on the corner of 5th Avenue and 65th Street. And if you looked at the 2 homes side by side, you couldn't imagine a greater difference. The style of look at me historicism that we saw in the A.T. Stewart house and that Mrs. Astor initially abhorred has now taken hold. And she has built herself an extraordinary quasi-French chateau on the corner there. It was a herald of things to come. The other thing that happened was an important zoning change. From about this point forward, all commerce was forbidden on 5th Avenue, north of 60th Street and south of 110th. This means that the blocks facing Central Park were commerce-free, and they assured that whoever built a home there, could enjoy a view in a neighborhood free from commercial intrusion. So, spurred by Mrs. Astor's example and this new zoning change, people began to move in earnest. Now, your choice of what to build there depended on a number of factors. One was your budget. If you had a lot of money, like Henry Clay Frick, you could buy a whole block along Fifth Avenue facing the park and build yourself a freestanding house. If you want to be a little more modest, you could just get a corner like Edward Berwin did here in this wonderful Venetian-inspired house. Or if you wanted to be yet more modest yet, you could choose to build an infill house the way Margaret Vanderbilt Shepherd did. Then there was the question of style. What should my house look like? Well, at this point, much of old New York was still a city of conservative brownstone row houses, largely understated, with tall stoops and Italian-inspired detailing. But as we saw at the A.T. Stewart House and with Mrs. Vanderbilt's example, things had changed. New money wanted to show it off. And there was a kind of unspoken competition to build the most elaborate, the most stylish, the most fashionable residence in Fifth Avenue or on the accompanying blocks. Now, the style you wanted your house to be built in had a lot to do with the associations you hoped your house would evoke, what it would say about you. And it also had to do with your choice of architect. For example, if you wanted a Loire-style chateau, you might hire C.P.H. Gilbert to design your house, as Isaac Fletcher on the left did, or as Felix and Frida Warburg did further north. On the other hand, if you were in favor of the height of Parisian fashion at that moment, the great Belle Epoque styles of the City of Light, you might, as Edith Fabry did, hire Hayden and Shepherd to build you the house on the left, or Oliver Gould and Henry Sloane did by hiring Flagg or Carrere and Hastings to build their homes next door to each other on 72nd Street. If you still wanted to be French, but perhaps slightly less flamboyant, for example, if you like the Place de Vosges in Paris, you could hire Carrere and Hastings, as William Starr Miller did on the corner of 86th Street, to build you something that looked like it came right out of the Marais. Or if your preference for things French was a little cooler and more classic, you could hire Hoppen and Cohn to design, as Harris Fonstok did, this house on 66th Street. Now, again, you don't have to be French to have French preferences to build a fancy house. If you happen to prefer things Italian, you could hire Stanford White to build you this house, as he did for Joseph Pulitzer on 73rd Street. It looks for all the world like it was transported, fully built off the Grand Canal in Venice. Or you could hire James Gamble Rogers, as Edward Harkness did, to build his house on the corner of 75th Street and Fifth Avenue, a more understated thing. Or wanted something really big, you could get a Roman palace of Palazzo Farnese style, as Otto Kahn built on Fifth Avenue further north at 91st Street. After the turn of the century, taste began to shift just a little bit, and there was a revival of interest in Georgian and federal styles, of things a little more native and American. So you could hire Delano and Aldrich, as Willard Straight did in 1913, to build this wonderful building on the left, or Little Treasure on 90th Street. This is the Emily Trevor House by Mott Schmidt, which incidentally is on the market in the moment if you are interested in purchasing some real estate. Now, by 1920, the economics of maintaining all these private mansions were becoming increasingly problematic. And there was increasing pressure to sell up, to find something that didn't require quite so much maintenance or so many servants. As a result, between 1923 and 1929, fully 1/3 of the stretch of Fifth Avenue facing the park was redeveloped. Houses were demolished at an astonishing rate, as quickly as they had risen in the decades before. Now, some of those houses have found happy new life as museums or as homes for foundations, schools, and consulates. That's true of the Frick Collection there at the upper left, or the Neue Galeria at the upper right, the Cooper Hewitt at the lower left, or the Jewish Museum that moved into the Warburg House at the lower right. Well, if all these mansions came down, those that didn't survive, what replaced them? My answer is apartments, large apartment houses that offered accommodations of unprecedented size and luxury. Now, of course, initially, apartment living was a tough sell. It was considered still vaguely a little bit unsavory. So how does one change that precedent? Well, the building that you see on the screen here, that's 998 Fifth Avenue from 1910, was a pioneer. This enormous building had only 17 apartments. They were designed to make apartment living, luxury living in essentially stacked houses acceptable. And the developer, Douglas Elliman, came up with a clever strategy. He offered very, very favorable terms to prominent people to get them, to induce them to move into the building. So former Vice President Levi Morton moved in, as did Murray Guggenheim, and most importantly, society lawyer and former Secretary of State Elihu Root all lived initially in this building. People began to say, well, if they can live in apartments, so can we. And 998 Fifth was followed by a huge number of other wonderful buildings designed by a surprisingly small number of architects, people like James Carpenter at the left, or Warren and Wetmore, or at the bottom, the wonderful Rosario Candela. Well, these buildings went up, as I say, early on. This crash of 1929 brought apartment construction along Fifth Avenue to a crashing halt. And when things improved after the war, Second World War, that is, the apartment look changed dramatically. Here, the dominant architects were father-son team, Sylvan and Robert Bean, and the buildings they built were very different from those that went before. First of all, they're built bulky. The apartments inside were much smaller. They didn't have 5 servants' rooms, for example. They didn't have 40-foot living rooms with 18-foot ceilings. They weren't built of limestone. Instead, they were built of often white brick. And they, in order to make up for the lack of those former elegant touches, they introduced such new features as balconies, for example. Would have been unthinkable in an earlier building. But if you look at the building in the center, for example, you'll notice that the balconies never quite caught on, because in this building, every one but 2 of them in that row has been enclosed and turned into an interior room. Clearly, there was still a demand for space. The apartment building picture of the 1960s and 70s was not a particularly happy time along Fifth Avenue. In those decades, you got buildings such as 985 Fifth Avenue on the corner of 79th Street. And to build those buildings, 4 wonderful townhouses for the Brokaw family were knocked down. And as a result, you got somewhat bleak and colorless apartment houses that for the first time broke the building line along Fifth Avenue. And it was done in the name of putting in curved traffic drives or automobile drives in front. The example of these buildings led to zoning changes to make things like this more difficult in the future. And then there were other instances. For example, at 1025 Fifth Avenue, architect Raymond Loewy demolished a wonderful townhouse, not to build an apartment house, but to build an entrance that would give access to large buildings that he built back further towards Madison Avenue, all in the name of ensuring that those buildings had a much coveted Fifth Avenue address. And then, of course, there's Philip Johnson's 1979 building at 1001 Fifth Avenue, a kind of architectural joke that has become less and less amusing over the years. Now, Upper Fifth Avenue, of course, is not just a street of mansions and apartment houses. This is Museum Mile, with the Metropolitan Museum being one of the other great institutions, like the New York Public Library, facing Fifth. It's the home of the Guggenheim Museum, Museum of the City of New York, and other institutions as well. Fifth Avenue and this blocks are also the home of some wonderful churches. On the left is the Church of Heavenly Rest at 90th Street. And there's Temple Emmanuel at the top there, one of New York's truly most glorious interiors. Lower right, St. Nicholas Orthodox Cathedral on 97th Street, just off Fifth Avenue. And then finally, a little treasure that's often overlooked on 109th Street and Fifth Avenue. This is the Church of St. Edward the Martyr, built way back in 1887. Now, above 96th Street, Fifth Avenue undergoes another change in character. There are apartment houses remaining, but these blocks between 96th and 110th become more and more blocks for institutions. They're dominated in many instances by hospitals like Flower Fifth Avenue on the left there, or particularly Mount Sinai. This is also the home of the New York Academy of Medicine in these blocks. Across the way in Central Park, however, is some of New York's most beautiful non-built environment. This is the home of the Conservatory Garden, one of the most beautiful planned spaces within the park, and also of the lesser known sections of park around the Harlem Mere, including the wonderful Harlem Boathouse there. Incidentally, the gate that leads into the Conservatory Garden there at the lower left on your screen used to stand at the corner of 58th Street and Fifth Avenue, providing entrance to the Vanderbilt mansion there, Cornelius Vanderbilt's mansion that was demolished to make way for the Bergdorf Goodman shop. At 110th Street, Fifth Avenue arrives at Duke Ellington Circle. This is the spot where 110th Street and Fifth Avenue meet, the northeastern corner of Central Park. Some interesting buildings there. Duke Ellington is honored by the statue you see in the moment. It was done by artist Robert Graham and was paid for largely by pianist Bobby Short, who went up in 1997. Nearby is 1280 Fifth Avenue, a combination apartment building and a home for the Africa Center on the left-hand side there, designed 2012 by Robert Stern. And then the Twin Towers, 1997 apartment buildings by Gruson Partners, that Schomburg Center that anchor that northeast corner of the park with two tall towers that mark the spot. Now, the blocks that we're going to encounter next, from 110th Street to 120th Street, were long transitional ones along Fifth Avenue. They lacked transportation. They were far north, and there was no way to get there. They somehow were in between. They were not a part of the world of Central Park, nor were they really all that well connected to Central Harlem. Building did eventually take place there, but very little of it remains today. The area was completely rebuilt during last 30 years as a result of urban renewal. But some of those new buildings are quite handsome. For example, at 1405 Fifth Avenue, it's a building by Harlem architect Roberta Washington, handsome apartment house. And across the way, the Fifth Avenue partnership houses. These fill the full block between Fifth Avenue and Madison Avenue at around 118th Street. And they're a wonderful attempt to bring back to this stretch of the avenue something of those rows of traditional New York townhouses that were demolished during urban renewal. This neighborhood also retains some traces of the earliest century when something interesting happened. Just around 1900, bridge and road construction began at the Lower East Side. That corresponded with the passing of the Tenement House Act. And as a result of these two things, thousands of Eastern European Jews were displaced from the Lower East Side and sought a new place to live. Many settled in these blocks, with the result that by 1900, this stretch of Fifth Avenue and the streets all leading off of it, centered on around 116th Street, was the third largest Jewish community in the world. And there's some traces of that remain. For instance, at the top on 116th Street is the Institutional Synagogue. On the right screen there, the wildly unconventionally designed and very exotic Shar Zadok synagogue, built in 1900. And at the lower left, the more sedate and classical Temple Israel from 1906. Now, all of these churches, all these synagogues have now been converted into churches as the former residents of the neighborhood moved on, some to the Upper West Side, some up to the Grand Concourse in the Bronx, and others to the suburbs. Now, at 120th Street, Fifth Avenue is interrupted. It runs smack into, in fact, Mount Morris, now called Marcus Garvey Park. Park. And most of you know probably that the majority of Harlem is a flat plain. But right here at this spot is a huge rocky outcropping, the exception to that geography. And it was recognized early that this rock mound here that became Marcus Garvey Park was impossible to develop because of all that stone. So way back in 1830, the city bought it and made it into a park. 1855, they put up a fire tower there, one of a number that were scattered around the city, and 2 cast iron designs by James Bogardus. Watchers were put on the top of these towers to keep an eye out for fires across the city, and if they sense one, they rang the bell that still hangs in the tower. Then, by the 1880s, the completion of L lines along 2nd, 3rd, and 9th Avenue. With that completion, development around Marcus Garvey Park absolutely took off. This became a wonderful upscale neighborhood with the city's mayors, politicians, and other city leaders moving into some of the finest brownstones and row houses in the city. And happily, many of these buildings are today being beautifully restored after years of neglect. It's been designated an historic district. North of 125th Street, Fifth Avenue remains today largely residential, a fascinating mix of private homes, public housing, and some very creative solutions to the challenges of urban living. For example, there's some wonderful survivors from the time when Harlem was an independent city, a largely rural community that wasn't part of New York at all. On the left there is 17 East 128th Street, a wonderful clapboard house that dates all the way back to 1864. And then on the right screen, a house that went up on 129th Street in 1863 and received this wonderful cresting and decorative porch in 1883. Nearby are some pioneering experiments in urban housing. What you see here is a building on Astor Row along 130th Street, just off Fifth Avenue. This was a group of 28 matching houses that were erected by William B. Astor on land that his family had held for generations. What they are, a series of paired 3-story houses, each of them set well back from the street. All of them have lovely front porches, and they're all separated from their neighbors, unlike traditional row houses, as a way of ensuring that the buildings have wonderful light and air. These too are in the process of being handsomely restored and returned to active life. Then a little bit further north at 108th Street, 38th Street, sorry, you come to Riverbend. This is a public housing building designed by David Brody in 1967 that tries to change for the good some of the worst things about former public housing went up in the 50s and 60s. Most of these apartments are duplexes. They have very interesting interlocking interesting spatial configurations inside. A lot of them have balconies. And these various buildings of the site that are grouped around a central courtyard are connected by second-story walkways that have patios and places for the kind of social interaction that is so often missing in the traditional urban development slabs. Now, Harlem is also a neighborhood of churches, and many of the very best are on or near Fifth Avenue. For example, here's Harlem Presbyterian facing onto Montmartre Park up at the top left. The Dutch Reformed Low Church of Harlem on the right there. Down below, St. Andrew's at 127th Street and Fifth Avenue. Really one of the great Episcopal churches of New York. And then just around the corner on 129th Street are James Renwick's 1883 All Saints Roman Catholic Church. These are just a few of the wonderful church buildings that still remain in this neighborhood. And then finally, we arrive at 142nd Street, the northernmost buildings on Fifth Avenue. This is the 369th Regimental Armory, built around 1930, and it's the home of the Harlem Hellfighters, a distinguished group of military men that also had some celebrities as part of it. For instance, Bojangles Robinson was the drum major for for the Hellfighters, and Werner Tandy, New York's first registered Black architect, was the regiment's commander. And the Armory provides us with a kind of symmetry. It has this great arched portal that lets you inside, and in a way, it echoes the portal where we began our walk, some 142 blocks to the south, down at the Great Arch on Fifth Avenue. And that takes us to the end of our tour. And with that, I'd like to say thank you for joining us, and good evening.
Oh, wow, Bill, that was great. Thank you so much. As a reminder, everyone, if you'd like to ask a question, please do so in the Q&A function. It's at the bottom of your screen. We have, while I let people type and we have a few questions, I'm going to start with a question of my own. And I don't expect you to have a definitive answer for it. Do you have a favorite Fifth Avenue building?
Oh my goodness. I could probably tell you 10 of them. You know, I have to say the building on the cover of the book, the New York Public Library, it's pretty hard to get better than that. This combination of dignity and elegance and welcome, fantastic building.
All right. I think I agree with that. So you talked a lot about the changes on Fifth Avenue and how it evolved with the city and with society moving northward. Do you still foresee Fifth Avenue changing even more?
You know, I think there's always evolution. I wonder, in fact, if you look at the blocks just north of Madison Square and south of 34th Street, already there are new hotels going up there and conversions of old hotels. I think we're going to see continued development there. I think maybe the blocks between 34th and 42nd Street, which are at the moment not the most elegant on Fifth Avenue, I suspect that real estate pressure is going to see some changes there. And I hope that the very northern blocks in Harlem continue to develop along the very encouraging lines that we've seen in recent years. Then again, I hope nothing changes down in the southern part in Greenwich Village.
I get that. So do you know who was the sculptor of the Mercury figures on the traffic signals?
I don't offhand, but I might be able to take a look. The designer of the original traffic signals, the ones that were in the middle of the street, was also the designer of the improved fixtures. And I have at the moment forgotten his name. Let me take a quick look and see if I can find that. Coming up with it right away. You have a man named Joseph Friedlander designed the fixtures themselves. Whether he in fact was the sculptor of the Mercury or not, I don't know.
All right. And are there any of those lights that are still up somewhere to be found in the city in a search?
Alas, no. And in fact, I'm just poking around trying to find examples if any of the sculptures, independent of the light fixtures survive. There don't seem to be very many of those around either. They're in, where did several hundred of these statues of Mercury go? It's a great mystery.
That is a great mystery. I wonder if they're all in a basement somewhere waiting to be found.
Right. The warehouse of the transportation department somewhere in, Queens or something.
Oh my goodness, we have somebody in here that says they have one.
My gosh.
Wow, that is quite interesting. Maybe we should reach out to them and figure it out how they got it.
Absolutely.
Oh goodness, I had one more question, and now it just went. Oh, not a question. Just a reminder for everyone: the link to purchase Bill's both books, both Fifth Avenue and Broadway, with 20% off, is in the chat, and also in the chat I put the link for our walking tour with Bill. Will not walk the entire Fifth Avenue. That will be a little bit too much, but a part of it on November 12th on a Saturday at 11 a.m. The link to register is there, and a reminder that you will receive a copy of the book at the day of the walk. It is included with your ticket. With that, Bill, thank you so much. And we're very much looking forward to our in-person walking tour.
Great, thank you. Here, I'll just give you the picker there. There's the, oh, I thought I had a picture of the Broadway book, but I don't. But it's the same approach as Fifth Avenue. But thank you very much for having me. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you, Bill. Have a great one. And thank you, everyone who attended. Good night.
Good night.